to be talked about tomorrow. So, strategies and solutions. Shield assets. Transfer your assets into entities such as corporations, limited partnerships, limited liability partnerships, limited liability limited partnerships, limited liability companies, only in certain circumstances, and land trusts. These are the basic tools we use for real estate investors to ensure that they maximize their tax benefits and they reduce their overall risk exposure. And we use a combination of them. You may not be familiar with some of these because they're not up in Canada. For example, land trusts. It's my understanding they don't work the same way they do in the States, but Greg will be talking about this particular entity. And if you're investing in the States and your property is encumbered, this will be the first entity you create when you own encumbered property down there to ensure that it's protected. And especially what we're referring to here is protected from the banks so they don't accelerate your note. It's, if you borrow money, to buy property, if you're not paying cash for it, then you're going to use a land trust to hold title to that asset initially. Now for Canadians who hold an interest in a trust, if the property is appreciated, you will have immediate gain recognition. But in the situation where we're going to be recommending you set this structure up, you've bought the property, so we don't have that gain recognition problem yet because full fair market value, your basis in it is what it's worth. But if you own property right now in the States, we probably wouldn't recommend you use a land trust. Well, we could set it up a certain way where it's already held by an entity, and we'll get into that at the end of the day. But just keep in mind, this is one of the tools that come into play when we're investing down there.
Sorry, Glenn, you said, I missed the piece, you said something was the first thing you're going to set up.
Land trust is the first entity you're going to set up when you're investing in the States. Because if you have encumbered property, that's what I was referring to. By debt, a bank. If you use a lender, they'll encumber it. When you purchase property, they take a deed of trust or a mortgage back against your property to secure the money that they've loaned you. So, to talk about those entities, I'm going to take them in order. A couple different options you have in the States. Let's talk about the corporations to begin with. In the U.S., we have what's called an S corporation, which is a flow-through entity. That is, any money that's generated inside of that company flows right down to the individual shareholder. Now, for certain types of businesses, basically service-type businesses in the U.S., this is a great entity because you can minimize employment taxes if you're paying a salary. But as a Canadian, this entity is not available to you. You cannot set up an S corporation. Let me go previous. As a Canadian, you have to be a U.S. citizen in order to be a shareholder in an S corporation. So when we're talking about corps, if you're ever considering setting this up, and if you've heard something online about S corporations, it does not apply to you. You cannot set up this form of entity. The only corporation or type of corporation you can create, a U.S. co, is a C corporation. Now, a C corporation is taxed at its own rate. That is, we have a certain tax bracket for C corporations based upon the amount of income they generate. A lot of people like C corporations because on their first $50,000 in earnings, there's only a 15% U.S. tax on those earnings. On the next 25% in earnings, it's 25%. I put out the tax table there for you so you can see that on under $100,000 inside of a C corporation, it's paying its own tax bracket, you're paying a reduced tax rate on that money. And so from that standpoint, it's a great way to run a business. The only problem from an investor's standpoint, as I see it, is that we typically do not hold property long-term inside of a C corporation. Here's how it works when I deal with a Canadian investor. One of the questions I'm going to ask you is, what is your intent with the funds? Do you want to leave them in the States, or do you want to repatriate those funds and bring them back? Because that's going to determine a lot on the type of structure we recommend for you when you set up down there. I've dealt with people who've told me that they come down to the States a lot and they're going to spend 3 months out of the year, 4 months out of the year down there. So they do not want a flow-through entity. They don't want that income tax back to them in Canada, so they leave it in a corporation, a C corporation. So they run their real estate investing through this C corporation. Typically, we'll see this used for people who are going to flip property down in the States. When you're actively turning property and you're buying and selling. Not so much for the holds. Because with a C corporation, you're taxed at these tax rates that you see there, but what you do not gain is the long-term capital gains rate that is available to an individual. That is, if you obtain your own individual taxpayer identification number in the States, then when you sell property, an asset that you've held for more than 1 year, your capital gains rate is 15% US. Now, let's assume that I had $300,000 in gain on property I've held for several years down there. Well, you can do the math. On 15% of $300,000, you're going to pay $45,000 in tax. But if you look at the C corporation's tax bracket, you're going to pay much more than 15% on the sale of that property in the US if that long-term hold property is held inside of the C corporation. And then you have the issue of bringing that money back into Canada. How is it going to be taxed to your company here? So what we look at in determining whether the corporation is appropriate for you, we're going to ask you, what is your intent? Do you intend to buy and sell property? If the answer is yes, then we're going to find ourselves leaning more towards the corporation, the US Co. for you. And then I want to know, do you intend to come down there and you want to keep that money in the US? Then it's probably going to be, this is what you should set up. If the answer to the second part is no, then I probably would tell you to hold off on creating a US corporation. And in fact, for purposes of many investors we work with, real estate investors wise, I don't set up a lot of C corporations for them unless they're really involved in just flipping property. But if they're buy and hold, that is, you want to obtain rental property down there for cash flow, I don't see much benefit in it until people have acquired maybe 10, 12 properties, because then what they're looking to do is pay a management fee up to their corporation. Looks something like this. And in your strategy would be something similar, but it would come back as far as a management fee to Canada. You have a US Co. here that manages these US entities that own real estate, and a tax strategy for US citizens is to decrease the amount of income that flows down to them personally, move some income up to their corporation as a management company so they can expense that money out, such as to pay for their educational courses that they've taken. That's a deduction to them. To pay for going out and looking at property. They want to run that through their corporation. So they turn it into a business, a property management business. And they do that by having this LLC pay a property management fee to their company. If you're investing in the States, you're not going to be necessarily in this situation because you're going to hire somebody else to manage your properties for you because you're not down there. I mean, I myself, what, we're in 7 states now, Greg? Yeah, in only one of the states do we manage the property. All of the other 6 states, we actually pay a property management company to manage our real estate for us because we're not around. And so I don't have a corporation set up for my management because that's all handled by somebody else. There wouldn't be a way for me to make money. But if you're in the States and you're managing your property in your local area, then it makes sense for people in the US. For Canadians, I don't see much of a benefit there for this structure. However, where you will find a benefit is if you were flipping real estate in the US and through your US Co. and you create your CanCo over here, you can have your Canadian company manage your US company. So here's a strategy where you want to flip property in the States, you want to keep most of the profits in the States, you don't want to repatriate them. However, you do want some of the profits coming back into Canada. In this situation, we'll set up a management agreement between your Canadian company and your US company to pull back X amount of dollars each year. So that'll be taxable in Canada. It's a deduction to the US company. You pay tax to your Canadian company, and you get it out of the US that way without getting hit with any type of double taxation. Another way you can structure that as well is if you put together a royalty agreement. So here's an idea. You come up with a methodology for investing. Now, you've used this methodology and you want to take it and apply it in the US. So then you license the idea to your U.S. company to go out there and buy property, however you're looking for it under your parameters. So you create a licensing agreement, and then you can move money back from the U.S. company back to Canada and still get a deduction for it in the U.S. This is an opportunity for people to move the money back. However, just like everything in the U.S., you have to keep in mind this. Bulls make money, bears make money, and hogs always get slaughtered. So do not be overly aggressive. If you say, we designed this scientific test, and it's accurate 100% when it comes to deductions in the U.S. It's called the SMILE test. If you talk about a deduction or a payment you're paying back to Canada and it brings a smile to your lips, it's typically too much, okay? Because if you got audited and the U.S. is auditing you and you said, this is awesome, look what I'm doing right here, okay? How are you going to look in orange is what I would ask you. Be careful there. It has to always be reasonable. Sometimes people get too excited and they want to move too much money back out and think they're going to strip that company. You're just creating red flags for yourself at that point in time. So there's ways to move money back without having it taxed in the U.S. Those are something else. All right. So moving on here. Next. So this was the corporate tax bracket. I showed you there the 15% on that first $50,000 is pretty cool. So Canadian owning a U.S. corporation as an individual. Pros, benefits, avoids probate upon your passing. This is something that we'll be covering on Saturday and Sunday. But see, a corporation never dies. A U.S. corporation, when you pass away, that corporation is going to stay there and the shares are going to be passed on to your kids. So that's a benefit. You don't have any incapacity issues if you're unable to make decisions for you. Greg's going to come up here a little later and talk about the importance of having a power of attorney if you're investing in the U.S. You should always have a financial power of attorney, a down sign giving your spouse, if you're married, the ability to make decisions on your behalf if you're incapacitated. One of the things about the U.S. when it comes to dealing with lenders, okay, they're really scared to make a decision unless they're ensured that they're protected. And so if both of you are on the loan or you're trying to close on a piece of property and you're dealing with escrow, it's very good to have a financial power of attorney for each spouse, giving the other one the ability to make decisions on their behalf. So if one of you can't make it, you can at least finalize the deal or deal with the institution. Avoids estate tax if owned by a Canadian corporation as well. That's another benefit. If you don't own it in your own name and you own it by your Canadian company, then there's no U.S. estate tax if you're going to set up a U.S. corporation. Okay. Now, the issues with owning a U.S. corporation to hold real estate long term. That you've got a 35% tax on the sale of property, typically, is what it's going to amount to with the U.S. company. Again, the U.S. estate tax is the issue. And if you use a property for personal use, then you have to account for that. So a lot of times people will tell me they're going to put their secondary residence in Florida in a U.S. corporation. And I tell them that's not what you want to do because that's going to be income tax to you under U.S. tax law when you go down there and you use that property. So I would avoid it. The only time I would utilize a U.S. corporation, again, is if you're flipping properties and you want to keep the money in the U.S. Then I would consider utilizing a U.S. corporation for my investing. And many times when I deal with Canadians who we're creating structures for and they tell me they want a corporation, I'll set up a three-way with their CPA just to ensure that we're all on the same page and we understand the tax ramifications of it. And I make the CPA tell me why he thinks it's best for his client to have that corporation. So I try to discourage people from setting it up because at the end of the day, you may not understand the tax implications to you when you dispose of your real estate.